The title of my talk, as I guess you know, is The Paralysis of Pacifism in Defense of Militant, Direct Action, and Violence. Now, the vegan and the animal rights movements are in very deep crisis. This crisis is so deep, they're not even aware of it. And the crisis is, to put it one way, that the more animals are slaughtered, the more the earth is destroyed, the weaker we become, rather than the stronger we become. So there is an inverse relationship that is very disturbing to watch. And in part, we have internalized what Freud calls the superego of the system. To put it another way, these movements, the vegan and the animal rights movement, suffer from what is known as the Stockholm Syndrome. The Stockholm Syndrome, as you may know, is a phenomenon that happened in Stockholm when people were captured by bank robbers and they identified psychologically with their oppressors. They sympathized with their oppressors. And all too often in these movements, the vegan and the animal rights movements, I noticed that there's more sympathy for the oppressors and being polite and being respectful rather than sympathy for the victims, the animals. So we are in a war. We are in a war to stop the animal holocaust. We are in a war to stop the destruction of the earth, and we are losing this war, and we are losing badly. And I think that we forgot how to fight. We forgot what it is to fight, or we're not aware that we are in a war. So I want to show how pacifism, which is universally presented as a noble philosophy, is a big part of the reason why we are losing. We are fighting a very, very powerful enemy, a corporate, industrial, military machine worldwide. And we need every tactic possible, every means at hand to fight this powerful opponent. And so what do we do instead? We tie our hands behind our back to make ourselves even weaker. They took the gloves off a long time ago. Now it's our turn to take the gloves off and to really start the fight back because we're running out of time. So I'm going to criticize pacifism. I'm going to talk about two kinds of pacifism. And I'm going to explain how pacifism is a dogma or a kind of religion, a fundamentalism. I'm going to define what violence is and what violence is not. I'm going to present arguments against violence and argue against those. And I'm going to present my own method for figuring out the best tactics to fight this war. So let's begin to talk about the fallacies of pacifism. First of all, the name has never been a very good name for what pacifism is or was, because it suggests a lack of action. It suggests a surrender, a refusal to fight. But when we look at the two paradigmatic examples of pacifism, Gandhi and King, we notice something else. We notice that they were anything but passive. That for them, pacifism meant action. It meant fight. It meant taking a confrontation to the oppressors. It meant standing up for what is right, no matter what the consequence. And it took courage and bravery. And people fought and died. So often they use different names for pacifism. One other name that's better is nonviolent civil disobedience. So when Rosa Parks in the United States in 1955 refused to sit at the back of the bus, nonviolent civil disobedience. And when the young black Americans refused to go away from the lunch counter that served only whites, nonviolent civil disobedience. Gandhi preferred the term satyagraha. And satyagraha means soul force, soul power, the power of the soul. And so when Gandhi broke laws in India, such as the famous Salt March, when thousands of people went into the sea and carried out cups of water to make salt, because the British imposed a tax on salt, and making salt was illegal, that was nonviolent civil disobedience, leading thousands of people to dissent, to refuse to cooperate with the system, because the system can only function if we cooperate with it, and that was satyagraha. Now, when I have arguments with pacifists, I notice something all the time. That is, in most cases, they don't know how to argue. They cite cliches. Violence only leads to more violence. An eye for an eye makes the world blind, etc., etc., etc. And so these aren't arguments. These are just cliches. And they present their statements as if they were universally true, and there were never any exceptions to these universal truths. But there are many exceptions to these truths. There are many counterexamples. Now, what we see when we look at pacifism today, instead of classical pacifism of Gandhi and King, is something altogether different. When we look, for instance, at a group of people in the U.S., really in different countries, called vegan abolitionists, and they follow their leader, their guru, named Gary Francione. What we notice is that, yes, they speak in cliches, but we notice a very marked difference between Gandhi and King and these new pacifists. We notice that these new pacifists don't act. They quote the language of Gandhi and King, but they never follow their actions. They don't support the ALF, certainly, as I'll say, they consider that violence. They don't support open rescues, which is done with minimum property damage and without masks. They never demonstrate. They never protest. They don't support any legislative action. All they will support is something vague they have no theory of, no practice of, called education. And what education means for the Francione camp is blogging to the converted. What education means for the Francione camp is attacking everyone who does not accept your method and means of doing nothing. So to be an abolitionist in this sense means to do nothing constructive. There is no education, there is no vegan outreach, there really is nothing at all. So, instead of pacifism, as we had in the classical sense, we have literally passivism. So all we have is this strategy called education. It sounds like the answer to all problems, huh? We educate people. Do you see any problems with that strategy? Can you educate everybody? Is the human mind always open to education? Or are there, as Freud said, all kinds of blockages to hearing truth, to understanding truth, to accepting truth? They operate with the most simplistic and naive model of human psychology and human behavior possible. After Freud, I thought Freud taught us something about the human mind. I thought Freud taught us that we are fundamentally irrational, not rational beings. You can also call this model the Socratic model, because Socrates said people do the wrong when they don't understand the right. So the reason why this place used to be a slaughterhouse is because the people who killed animals here, they didn't understand it was wrong. And if only Francione were here to tell them, all the violence would have stopped. And you see, when people have a vested material interest in killing, in raping the earth, it makes it almost impossible for them to listen or to be open to change. And the only way violence and oppression and domination have been stopped in history is by force. And notice Gandhi and King used force, coercion. Of course, they spoke to the human heart. They made appeals to compassion, to reason, to the Bible, to the Constitution. But they flexed their muscle. They went out into the street with thousands of people. They blockaded the roads. They made people stop doing what was wrong. So one problem with pacifism of any kind is this naivete of human nature that education alone will work. And remember again, Gandhi and King did not think that education alone would work. They used mass force. But the pacifists today in our movement have forgotten about mass force and rely on education only, vegan pamphlets, web pages, etc. Now, here's the second problem with the pacifist position. They falsify history. They lie. If you look at the so-called victory that Gandhi won for independence against the British state, oh my God, Gandhi did it all by himself. And Gandhi, the hero, the one man who changed history. Of course, thousands of people followed him, but it was Gandhi's brilliant mind that won this victory. Well, let me tell you something that the pacifists won't tell you, and the history books typically don't. There were all kinds of forces operating in the political scene in India. And many of these forces were violent. They used guns and they used bombs, and they gave the British a little extra emphasis, another reason to get the hell out of India. Or look at the situation in the United States in the middle 1960s. Martin Luther King, the hero, did it all by himself. If it weren't for Martin Luther King, we would not have had the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Let me tell you something about that. A lot of black America didn't even know who Martin Luther King was, but they knew who Malcolm X was, they knew who the Black Panthers were, and they knew what urban riots were. When Malcolm X said you have the right to defend yourself against the police, against their violence, with violence, and when the Black Panthers armed themselves with rifles, and when angry blacks all throughout California and other places set cities on fire, that had an impact on social change. Martin Luther King would never have been able to rise above as the respectable force he was without Malcolm X and without the Black Panthers and without the rioters. One more example, Vietnam. The reason why the U.S. lost the Vietnam War, the reason why we left Vietnam is because the most powerful military machine in the world got its ass kicked by peasants with guns. We lost that war on the battlefield. Peasants defeated the mightiest army in the world. It had nothing to do with hippies chanting in the streets. We suffered a military defeat. It had nothing to do with passive, nonviolent resistance. And I could give you many such examples, that history is complex, and pacifists have made it simple. They read it the way that they want you to understand it. They take out all the historical actors that were responsible for change who weren't pacifists to make only pacifists responsible for change. Now, let's talk about the definition of violence. All the time, I hear about myself, I hear about people who share my beliefs. You are pro-violence. I'm not pro-violent. I don't fetishize violence. I don't like to see violence. I don't like to see people hurt. I certainly don't like to see animals hurt. It's the difference you see between being pro-choice in the anti-abortion debate, pro-choice, and pro-abortion. Who the hell is pro-abortion? More abortion, more abortion, more abortion. I'm for abortion. No, we're for choice. I am not for violence. I am for defending the innocent when violence is the only means that we have to defend the innocent. Now, there is a very broad definition of violence that really bothers me. And I want you to understand that when we're talking about the debate over violence in the animal rights movement, we are talking almost always about one thing. Nobody's talking about guns and weapons. Nobody's talking about bombs and explosives. We are talking about sabotage or property destruction. This movement has almost never used violence against anyone, anytime. And given the extent of the animal holocaust, the restraint this movement has shown to being nonviolent is absolutely amazing. In other words, we are not using violence in the literal sense of the term. The debate is over sabotage and the Animal Liberation Front tactics. Now, you know about the Animal Liberation Front. They emerged in England in 1974. And they are committed to breaking into laboratories and freeing animals from cages. And they are committed to using property destruction against oppressors to weaken them economically. And the pacifists say this is violence. Really? This is violence? If I throw a brick through a window, that's violence? You're really stretching the definition of violence to condemn that as violence. But when you cut the neck of a pig, that is violence. So what we're really talking about here in the debate of violence is whether sabotage is an acceptable tactic or not. And to call the destruction of things, of windows, of doors, of equipment, violence to defend animals, this is the Stockholm Syndrome. We have internalized the language and the thinking of the oppressors. This is absolutely ridiculous. So I insist on using violence in a very narrow and literal sense of the term. To be violent is to intentionally cause physical injury to someone without just cause. And that's the only definition of violence that I will accept as legitimate and plausible. You see the consequences of calling sabotage violence or calling it terrorism, eco-terrorism? You lose all sense of proportion. You lose all sense of distinction. To break a window and to break a head is the same thing. They're both violence for the pacifists, and they're both forms of terrorism. It's like breaking into a laboratory and 9/11 are the same thing. So this trivializes the real violence of what is happening to the animals. Even the most basic distinctions we could make, they don't bother to make. Between, for instance, offensive or aggressive violence, whereby I intentionally want to hurt someone who is innocent, or defensive violence, where I use violence if I have to protect the innocent when no other means is available. But that's not really violence anyway, is it? It's called self-defense. Now, there are two kinds of arguments against violence in the animal rights movement. Let's distinguish between those. What I call the principled argument and the pragmatic argument. The principled argument says violence, the use of violence to protect animals is always wrong in principle because it's morally wrong. And the pragmatic argument against using violence to protect animals from exploiters says that violence is wrong because of the consequences of using violence. Specifically, it alienates the public, it gives us a bad image, it's never effective, and it's ultimately counterproductive. Okay, so you see those are two very different arguments. So let me quickly dispose of each one. I did a book called Terrorists or Freedom Fighters, you might have seen. And in this book was an essay by a very famous pacifist named Tom Reagan, and he titled his essay, How to Defend Violence. A very provocative essay for pacifists to write. Basically, he used the argument of just war. The just war argument says this: some wars are just, are legitimate, and you can use violence if it's the last means available to use. It's a whole theory. It's a political theory, just war theory. And to make this very simple, if violence is the last resort you have at self-protection or protecting the innocent, then it is legitimate. It's not your first option. That's not legitimate, only if it's your last option. Well, I have to ask, when do we know when it's a last option? Haven't we kind of got the point that there is a war going on against animals in the earth? But you see, what Tom Reagan did was he opened a door toward possibilities for legitimate use of violence, and then he said this: but really, there is never a legitimate excuse for using violence. Really, there's always some other alternative. Okay, so for instance, the rhinos and elephant that are being slaughtered by a mafia crime syndicate for their horns, by very powerful organized crime syndicates. There's some other choice to stop this? to stop poaching besides warfare? Because that's how it's being stopped. We have soldiers, we have armies fighting against poachers with guns. Okay, so that's Tom Reagan, that you can use violence in the last instance only, but there's never a last instance. There's always an alternative. And I suggest, such as in the case of South Africa, there are no alternatives. Now, quickly, another example for the principled argument against the use of violence. In his book, Animal Liberation, Peter Singer says, the only way we will win is by staying on the moral high road. He says it is the force of our arguments, not the force of our bombs, that will allow us to win this war. First of all, who the hell is talking about bombs? Nobody. Second of all, the force of our arguments, I try to suggest, the force of our arguments is very limited. Our arguments are true. They're the best arguments in the world for anything, but they're still very weak against oppressors. Moreover, Singer is assuming a second very naive model that the pacifist argument is dependent upon. The pacifists say use education, and many will say use legislation. Go through the state. Make laws to protect the animals. Use that second peaceful route available to us. Again, very naive. The state is controlled by corporations. This is so very clear from the shack movement in the UK and the US. The corporations under attack by the animal liberation went to the state and said, come here, we want to talk to you. Make some laws right now to stop these animal liberationists. We're tired of this. They're hurting our profits. And the state said, yes, master, yes, master. Because as Marx taught us in the 19th century, the state is the legal arm of the ruling class. So we are not going to win the war through the peaceful tactics of education or legislation. Now, let me quickly go over the pragmatic argument against violence. I know it's hot in here tonight. This argument says we must not use violence. Again, what violence? Because the consequences alienate the public. They don't work. They're counterproductive. Every damn day, the Animal Liberation Front, the Earth Liberation Front is attacking corporate exploiters. Every day. How often do you see this in the media? How the hell is this going to alienate the public if they never hear about it? A tiny percentage of the actions are reported. Pretty hard to alienate the public when they're ignorant of the struggle, of the war that's being waged against animal exploiters. Second, this argument is deterministic. It suggests that the media reporting may not be double-coded. It may not somehow present these actions sympathetically. It assumes that everyone watching the television report will be turned off and alienated. But some people are turned on and excited. They go, oh my God, look at those brave activists. Why are they taking such extreme measures against these exploiters and corporations? The situation must be extreme. I admire these people. I want to do this too. Sometimes it happens this way. We know from people's stories that sometimes people are excited by these reports, not always alienated. And this is one of the biggest lies that pacifists tell over and over and over. That every time an animal is set free from a cage, that every time a research building is burnt down with no one harmed, they're always replaced. So it's ineffective. It always returns to normal. My answer to this, I have three answers to this. Bullshit, bullshit, bullshit. Time after time after time, these exploiters are shut down. They don't return. They're gone, gone, gone forever. Animals are liberated that people don't even know are in prison. And perhaps a very famous example that you might be aware of is Britches the monkey. Remember that story? You can go on YouTube and look it up. Britches the monkey. She was kept in isolation in total darkness. Her eyes were sewn shut. They pumped into her head loud industrial sounds. Only the ALF knew that Britches was being tortured. And the ALF went in and got her out. And then you see pictures of Britches. And to see pictures of Britches in a tree with fellow monkeys, free, with her eyes open and happy, is enough to set you to tears. And it's enough to make you violently mad against pacifists for these damn lies. Hundreds, not just Britches, hundreds of thousands of animals are free that will never be in prison again. So this is just a terrible, slanderous lie against the animal liberation movement. Counterproductive? This is the most productive tactic this movement has ever developed. You want to look at counterproductive? You want examples of counterproductive actions? Yes. Okay. How about PETA with their naked girls? That's real productive, huh? How about the Humane Society of the United States, the RSPCA, with their humane meat? That's real productive. That's counterproductive. The ALF is not counterproductive. Mainstream tactics are counterproductive. They are collaborating with corporations. That is counterproductive. Okay, so now I'm going to conclude. I've said that pacifism of any kind is highly flawed for many reasons. It's dogmatic. It allows for no exceptions. It likes simplicity. Exceptions are too complicated. It's a religion, and religion does not allow for complexity. It has a false view of human nature and human psychology. It has a false view of the state. It lies about history, and it lies about the ALF. Now, it wants to limit our tactics to something called education and maybe legislation and nothing else. I want to expand our tactics. Open up this war to any and all tactics that work. That doesn't mean we go out there with guns blazing and hand grenades. It means we do it by any means necessary and we act intelligently. So my method for deciding which tactics are the best is threefold. Number one, it's pragmatic. That means I'm more concerned with what works than principles. Now, what works, not purity, moral purity. The moral high ground is great. I'd love if we could win this war with education and nonviolence. I would love it, but we can't. And I got to ask these pacifists all the time, what's more important to you? Your principles or the animals? Your nonviolent bullshit or animal liberation? Okay? So, number one, my tactics are dictated by what's pragmatic, by what works for the animals, not highfalutin moral principles. Second, my method is contextualist. Anytime we need to free an animal, any campaign we have, they're all different situations. They're different campaigns. They're in different regions of the world. There are different laws or lack of laws. There are different forces at work, different possibility. And we look at each situation as a unique situation. The only rule is there are no rules. Nobody knows what works. There's no formula for what works. So in some situations, a protest will be adequate. In other situations, it's good to pick up the phone and make a threat. Yeah, hi, I'm your friendly animal rights activist. And if you don't stop breeding puppies in your backyard, I promise you I will kick your ass. That may work. Or we have to break into a laboratory. That may be what is necessary. Every situation is unique. Figure out what works best in that situation. And don't use violence. Don't use destruction if you don't have to. But if you have to, damn it, use it. Now, finally, my tactic is pluralist. That means, to quote Malcolm X, by any means necessary. Again, that means all tactics are on the table. Nothing is taken off. And if that means that a guy who is killing cats in a neighborhood needs a lesson with the help of a baseball bat, then he's going to get the lesson with the help of a baseball bat. So we have to face a very grim truth. What the animal rights and environmental movements are doing so far is not working. The environmental movement is 40 years old. The modern animal rights movement is 40 years old. Animal protectionism goes back to the early 19th century, 200 years old. And in 200 years or in 40 years, we are losing ground. This century is the time of reckoning. This is the time, by the end of this century, believe me, this life, this planet will be uninhabitable. The United Nations says by 2050 it will be unrecognizable. So in this current context of total war against life, actions that some people think are reasonable and moderate are just unreasonable and immoderate. Actions that people think are radical and extreme are simply necessary. And as I said, these questions are not easy. There is a dialectic, a circle of violence and nonviolence. They are not opposites. No more than night and day are opposites. Sometimes it takes violence to bring nonviolence. Sometimes it takes war to stop war. And also, nonviolence perpetuates violence by tolerating it, by believing it will go away through education or legislation, by not doing enough. And if we continue on this path where pacifism it remains an entrenched dogma of these movements, by the year 2050, let's say, people will look back on activists today and they will be able to conclude truthfully that pacifists were complicit in violence. Thank you.